Okay, good afternoon, and welcome on this February 15th with snow out there and cold. And they just put a Carvel cake out there, and I'm saying, why am I speaking when there's a Carvel cake here? Anyway, it's a good afternoon. It is Black History Month, and a lot of this talk that I'm giving you is personal. My career as a journalist. I got to meet some of these people that I am going to talk about. Now, I've never met Woody Strode, but you might remember Woody Strode from his role in Spartacus. He was in Spartacus, among others. I never met Jackie Robinson, but you're going to hear a lot of Jackie Robinson stories. Also, you're going to hear a lot of Jesse Owens stories. And Joe Louis is involved. And Elgin Baylor. And Bill Russell. And how many of you watched the Super Bowl the other day? Anybody? Two people reluctantly saying, yeah, I watched the Super Bowl. Well, the Super Bowl comes out of the civil rights movement, and a boycott in New Orleans creates the Super Bowl inadvertently. Ali, I've been with Ali. Unfortunately, when I got to Ali, the brain damage had kicked in, and I really didn't have too much interaction with him. But one of my best friends, Shelley Saltman, was his promoter. So I got some stuff that Shelley told me. And that is Woody Strode, and he's in Spartacus. If you might recognize the guy behind him, Kirk Douglas. And there was also somebody else in that movie, a guy by the name of Bernie Schwartz. Ever hear of Bernie Schwartz? Tony Curtis. Bernie Schwartz from Seward High School in Lower Manhattan, where my mother went to school. Bernie Schwartz is probably the most famous alum of Seward High School. Anyway, so this is a tale about how African Americans were discriminated against in sports and how it impacted them and what happened. We start with this guy from New York by the name of Daniel Reeves. He owned the National Football League's Cleveland Rams team, and he decided after 1945 he's going west in 1946 or south. He's either going to Los Angeles or he's going to Dallas. And he decides Los Angeles because I believe it'll become the greatest professional football town in the country. And it's very, very complicated as to how he got there. National Football League owners were concerned about travel costs because the league really ended in Chicago and they didn't want to go down Route 66 to get out to LA. They wanted to go by plane. Train was too long. And Reeves responds by saying, well, if you're not letting me go to LA, I am going to quit professional football altogether. And he shouts, and you call this a national league? Well, you can consider the Cleveland Rams out of pro football. Actually, they were out of pro football. They left Cleveland, or he took his team out of Cleveland. No major league franchise in any sport had called a West Coast city home before. Air travel, very early stages. Los Angeles was a 2,000 long, hard land miles away from the nearest city, Chicago. And there was no tradition for pro football at all in Los Angeles. It was all colleges. By the way, who was the most famous college football player out of USC? Do you know?
No.
His name was Marion Morrison, but you know him better as John Wayne. John Wayne got kicked off the football team, and he went to the Fox lot, became kind of a stuntman, and the rest is history. In the 1920s, the Los Angeles Coliseum Commission banned pro football teams from its stadium. That is Kenny Washington, who would play with Los Angeles. The Cleveland Rams owner, Daniel Reeves, had to hire Negroes in 1946 as part of his agreement to move to the Los Angeles Coliseum. And there was some opposition, including from George Preston Marshall, who was the Washington owner, who would tell you he was a racist. How many of you know Maury Povich? Okay, he had that show, Hoosiers. May still have it for all I know. Well, his father, Shirley Povich, was the Washington Post sports editor, Washington Post, in the 50s and 60s. And he once wrote about George Preston Marshall. and it's kind of an open letter in the paper. Said, by the way, when will Washington have Negro players? And George Preston Marshall's response, when the Harlem Globetrotters hire a white guy. By the way, the other thing about Shirley and Maury Povich's Who's Your Daddy show, somebody once asked Shirley, who I met once or twice, lived to about 100 years old, what do you think of your son's show? And he said, I couldn't stand it. And then he showed me his paycheck. And he said, where could I get one of those shows? Anyway, Reeves hired Kenny Washington and Woody Strode. The NFL had a color barrier up between 1934 and 1945. Getting a lease from the Los Angeles Coliseum would change the league. And some owners like George Preston Marshall was totally against it. This is a guy you probably never heard of. His name was Haley Harding, and he's a former athlete who became a journalist, and he was an editor of a black newspaper in Los Angeles. And the Los Angeles Tribune was the name of the paper. He took to the microphone, and he outlined how the Los Angeles Coliseum, which was built for the 1932 Olympics, or at least it was used in the 1932 Olympics, was built by federal and state money. And he said, you know what? You can't have a segregated team in there. If federal money was there, if state money was there, you have to desegregate the team and the league. Harding explained to the NFL owners, NFL commissioners, and others that the public in Los Angeles and parts of the West didn't see the black and white differences the way the rest of the country did. He noted that blacks had served in World War II, remember that because that's going to come up again in a few minutes, that they had been key to much of the war preparation that took place in Los Angeles. They helped build and fund the Coliseum. It was singularly strange that no team had signed a player like Kenny Washington, who in 1939 was by far the best college football player in America, and there was Kenny Washington. Kenny Washington, Woody Strode. With the National Football League's Los Angeles Rams became the first two Negroes in the league since Joe Lilliard suited up for the Chicago Cardinals on December 3rd, 1933. Coincidentally, it's when George Preston Marshall starts amassing power in the league as the owner of the Boston team, and he moved down to Washington. NFL always said, well, we don't have a color barrier, it's just that we can't find any Negroes good enough to play in the league. That's not true. The guy to the left is Fritz Pollard. The guy to the right you probably know more so from singing, Paul Robeson.
Oh.
Paul Robeson. This is a picture of the two of them in 1918. And Paul was a college football player, so was Fritz. There was a total of 9 black players that suited up for the NFL teams between 1920 and 1926. Including Paul Robeson. I bet you didn't know he was a pro football player. He also went to Columbia Law School. He was quite the bright individual. Anyway, Robeson was there, J. Mayo Williams, Fritz Pollard, and Bobby Marshall. They were the first black players in the league in 1920. In fact, Fritz Pollard was so good, he was the co-coach of the Akron Pros in 1921. All 9 of those African-American players were removed from the league by the end of the 1926 season. There was a handful of black players who were in the league between 1928 and 1933. The NFL systematically removed the Negro players over an 8-year period. Lilliard and the Pittsburgh Pirates player, Ray Kemp, were the last Negro players on rosters in 1933, rather 1933. And that was the last season with Negro players. Strode and Washington's teammates never accepted them. 33 guys on the team, 31 white guys like that, and they were tossed aside. That was the prejudice against them. There was a new league that started as well called the All-American Football Conference, and there was no color barrier in that league. That started right after the war in 1946. That's Paul Brown, who I interviewed around 1988 or so, and I asked him about breaking the color barriers. I didn't care. White, black, green, chartreuse, Martian. If they could play for me. Bill Willis, Marion Motley were hired by Paul Brown to the Cleveland Browns. They They became teammates and lifelong friends. And they did this about 6 months before Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier of Major League Baseball. They endured taunts, racial slurs, dirty play from opponents on the field. Brown kept them home from a game in Miami in 1946 because of death threats. But their teammates welcomed them. Okay, how many of you are old Brooklyn Dodger fans here? How many of you saw this guy play? You saw him play? How many of you snuck into Ebbets Field? Second, there was a guy out in right field, second inning, the guy was drunk, he could walk in, he wasn't going to stop you. Anyway, Jackie Robinson makes Major League Baseball history by becoming the first African-American player since this guy played in 1884. His name is Moses Fleetwood Walker, and he played with the Toledo team of the American Association. There were two Americas in 1884 and also in 1947. That's the Henry Ford Museum, believe it or not. The Henry Ford Museum is not only about cars, it's also about civil rights. Go figure. But then again, Henry Ford's heirs tried to clean up his image, Dearborn Independent and all that. So it's a civil rights museum as well. My wife is sitting in the colored waiting room. Two Americas, water fountains, separate. Until 1963, at Penn Station in New York, there were separate water fountains for whites and colored. 8th Avenue, 7th Avenue, 33rd, 31st Street, separate water fountains. Two Americas. This is from a civil rights museum as well, and in Mobile, Alabama, colored entrance. That was what Jackie Robinson broke into. And there is Jackie Robinson, Brooklyn Dodgers on April 15th, 1947. Jackie Robinson, age 28, becomes the first African-American player in Major League Baseball in the 20th century when he steps onto the field on Ebbets Field in Brooklyn to compete for the Brooklyn Dodgers, since Moses Fleetwood Walker did it in 1884 along with his brother Weldy. Robinson broke the color barrier in a sport that had been segregated for 63 years. Moses Fleetwood Walker made his debut in the American Association with Toledo. That was a major league at the time, along with the National League. On May 1st, 1888, he was a catcher for the Toledo Blue Stockings in their game against Louisville, against the Eclipse squad. The Chicago White Stockings of the National League, now the Chicago Cubs, arrived in Toledo for an August 1883 exhibition game. Cap Anson, Chicago's player-manager and probably the biggest star in the game at that time, was furious upon learning that there was a black player on the Toledo roster. And there is Cap Anson, and Cap Anson is known as the father of segregated baseball. He said, yeah, well, there's money on the line. When money talks, who walks, right? There was money on the line. So, okay, we'll play. But I'm never ever going to play against a black man after that. Anson was very vocal and on the field, off the field, keeping baseball segregated, and he is known today as the father of segregated baseball. Walker played 42 games in 1884 for Toledo. He was joined by his brother Weldy, who played a few games. At the end of the 1884 season, both are gone, never to be seen again on a baseball field, major league or minor league baseball field. Gentlemen's agreement. There was no formal agreement, we're going to keep Negroes out of baseball, just a handshake, a wink and a nod. That was it. Black players like Walker would lose their place in baseball in 1877. Major league and minor league team owners adopted a secret gentleman's agreement or an unwritten rule saying that no new contracts would be given to black players. Gentleman's agreement was similar to Jim Crow laws adopted by some states, particularly in the South, effectively forcing black players out of all professional leagues by 1900. And Anson had an ally, and I'm going to ask you a question. How many of you played with that little pink ball, punch ball, stoop ball, stick ball? Yeah, you played with that. Hit the penny. hit the dime. What'd you call it?
Spalding.
Spalding.
Yeah.
He called it a Spalding.
Not with a G, that's wrong.
But it's Spalding. This is the guy, H.E. Spalding, who had the sporting goods company that produced the Spalding. And he was the ally keeping blacks out of baseball back in the 1880s and 1890s. So that pink ball was a Spalding, not a Spalding. But I can never say Spalding. It's always going to be a Spalding. And if you tell your grandkids say about Spalding, what do they say? What? 2 sewers.
Right.
2 sewers, stickball, right? 2 sewers. One guy in here, and the woman is telling me about stickball and stoop ball. There you go. American National League, and the predecessor called the American Association, and minor leagues like the International League had a color barrier up between 1890 and 1946. No formal agreement, but no African Americans on the field, and if we can, let's keep them out of the stands, like Connie Mack in Philadelphia. He did not want any Negroes inside his baseball park to watch his Philadelphia A's play baseball. And come to think of it, the Philadelphia A's baseball team was so bad in the 30s and 40s, who would want to see them anyway, which is why they ended up in Kansas City. African Americans ended up in the Negro League, and just 2 days ago, it was the 104th anniversary of the beginning of the Negro baseball leagues. Or they went barnstorming and ended up in Mexico or Cuba, where they could live comfortably and make a good living playing baseball. Now, John J. McGraw was the manager of the Baltimore Orioles. Then he came to New York in 1903. And he wanted to sign this guy. His name is Charlie Grant. And he was a light-skinned black American player who McGraw said, no, he's a Native American. He's not black. Grant, who played for teams around Chicago, was invited to work out for McGraw, who was managing the Baltimore Orioles in the newly formed American League. McGraw said Grant was a Cherokee by the name of Charlie Tokuhama. That's the name he gave him, Charlie Tokuhama. But the Chicago White Sox owner, Charles Kaminsky, knew of Grant and said, you're not going to do it. This is the guy who founded the National Negro League in 1920. He had been the owner of the independent all-black team, the Chicago American Giants, and he founded the Negro National League 104 years ago and 2 days ago. With greater population bases, it was felt that the cities in the north could support the teams in Foster's new league, and that's where it went. Other Negro leagues soon sprouted up as part of a large and profitable baseball industry throughout the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Patterson had a Negro League team in that stadium that was just renovated. I met this guy about 40 years ago, Sam Lacey. Didn't really talk to him at the time, but I was a young guy. I was in my 20s, and he was an older guy who was working out in Baltimore. I met him at Yankee Stadium. In 1936, he was working for a black newspaper in Baltimore, and he began lobbying the Washington Senators owner Clark Griffith to consider adding star players from the Negro Leagues, and particularly those playing for the Homestead Grays team that leased Griffith Stadium in Washington for its home games. It took him a while, but Lacey finally got a face-to-face meeting with Griffith in December 1937. I use the old cliche about Washington being first in war, first in peace, and last in the American League, although they were in the World Series in 1933, and that he could remedy that. But he told me that the climate wasn't right yet. This is 1937, and civil rights, well, it was a problem in 1937. He pointed out there were a lot of Southern baseball players in the league, and there would be constant confrontations, and moreover, it would break up the Negro Leagues. He saw the Negro Leagues as a source of revenue. This is the guy that recommended Jackie Robinson to Branch Rickey. His name is Wendell Smith. And he was the guy giving credit to finding Jackie and telling Rickey, this is the guy you want. An individual with strong character who could successfully execute the integration of baseball. Now, how many of you remember Ralph Kiner, the Mets announcer?
I've heard the name.
Heard the name?
My husband knows.
Yeah. Ralph played the part of a bumbling fool on Mets games. Mispronounced words, told stories. But you know what? Remember Phil Harris on Jack Benny Show? Well, that was Ralph's next door neighbor. And Ralph learned a lot about showbiz from Phil Harris in Palm Springs. So Ralph has this goofy, buffoon-type image. But Ralph inadvertently pointed me out to a number of things I'm going to be talking about. He said that there was a movement going around New York to get the game integrated. And, well, there were protests, and I looked into it after Ralph started telling me about it. Protests here in New York admit Negroes into big league baseballs. Unions and civil rights groups picketed outside of Yankee Stadium, the Polo Grounds, Ebbets Field, and also in Chicago at Comiskey Park and Wrigley Field. They gathered more than 1 million signatures on petitions demanding that baseball tear down the color barrier. In July 1940, the Trade Union Athletic Association held an End Jim Crow in Baseball demonstration at the World's Fair, which is only a stone's throw away from where the Mets play baseball today. The Wizard of Oz? Well, that's not the Wizard of Oz. That's the Commissioner of Baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis. But, hey, remember when they pulled the curtain and you saw the Wizard of Oz and he was just a regular guy? Well, maybe you could apply this to this former federal judge who was the baseball commissioner. The petitions asked fans if they were willing to allow the Yankees, Dodgers, or Giants to sign a black player if he was able to make the team. After a year and a half, they had over 1.5 million signatures, and they landed on Judge Landis's desk. Fans would support black players. Paul Robeson went before Landis in 1943 asking for integration. They allowed him to speak, but the owners were instructed by Landis not to ask him any questions. He gave his speech, he was thanked, shown the door. When he was asked point blank, the former federal judge, tough guy, suspended guys for gambling or alleged gambling during 1919 on the World Series, and Landis said, it's the owner's decision, it's not my decision. 1941 through 45, more than 1 million black Americans served in their country in World War II, the United States. When military units were segregated, some did play on integrated baseball teams while overseas. This is an ad. There's a baseball player in this ad here, and there's a dead soldier here, World War II. Done by a New York City councilman by the name of Benjamin Davis, who was a communist. Good enough to die, but not good enough to pitch. Running for re-election to the New York City Council in 1945, Ben Davis, an African-American former college football star and a communist, distributed a leaflet with photos of 2 blacks, a dead soldier and a baseball player. Good enough to die for his country, but not good enough to pitch. And there is Benjamin Davis Jr. back in the 1940s. Remember, Kiner told me there was stuff going on. New York State Legislature passed the Quinn Ives Act, which banned discrimination in hiring, and soon formed a committee to investigate discriminatory hiring practice, including one focused on baseball. The New York State Legislature was about ready to make a law saying, hey, you cannot operate here if you are a segregated business. Ralph Kiner, New York Mets announcer. And Ralph and I spoke about this over the years. And this is one of his interviews that, I got a gift, it's on tape, so it must be an interview. It was just another part of the changeover of baseball. It had to happen sooner or later. It was really an aftermath of World War II where the black players, or Negroes, fought for our side. They had to be recognized. There was a movement at the time that they were going to bring black players into the game. Branch Rickey, who Kiner absolutely hated, just absolutely hated. Kiner would say that he led the league in home runs 8 straight years. Pittsburgh finished last. And Branch Rickey said, well, we finished 8th with you. We can finish 8th without you. You're not going to get a raise. So Ralph didn't like him. But anyway, he says of Rickey, Rickey was the man who picked Robinson, and that was a brilliant choice. Larry Doby came from not too far from here, I think. Montclair, New Jersey. Yeah. And in 1997, on the 50th anniversary of him breaking into the major leagues, I had a chance to interview him. And it was a lengthy interview, and I'm going to spare you the 55 minutes and just boil it down to about 4 minutes, because it is an interesting interview, but then again, it is 55 minutes. Anyway, there was Larry Doby. Mr. Rickey, Mr. Robinson, Jackie Robinson, and Mr. Veeck, the owner of the Cleveland Indians, gave me an opportunity to be in the American League. So I have to say that if Jackie had not made it, I probably would have not been given the opportunity. When you talk about what goes through your mind 50 years ago, you have to think of Mr. Rickey, who had the courage to do it, and you think about Mr. Robinson, who had the courage to do it, and you think about Mr. Veeck, who had the courage to do it, and me, who had the opportunity to do it. And there's Bill Veeck and Larry Doby. I'm just going to, just one aside about Bill Veeck. He was wounded in World War II, lost a leg. And I didn't know this at the time. But he started smoking a cigarette. We're doing an interview, and he's smoking a cigarette, and he puts up his leg like this, and he had an ashtray carved into the leg, and he's flicking his ashes into that ashtray carved into the leg. Anyway, interesting sidebar. A lot of people ask me, Jack gets a lot of headlines, and you don't get much headlines. Both Robinson and Doby were in the same boat. They were both verbally abused, had to live a separate life on the road from their teammates in separate hotels, almost always in the poorest side of town in certain cities. When the guy is first, he should get the headlines. I know myself, my friends know I was involved in the same type of thing he was involved with. And there is Jackie and there is Larry. I'm not going to go around asking for publicity, politicking for publicity, but I know what I have done, and I know I have helped some people to accomplish what they've done in terms of coming into the American League. And it makes you feel good to be part of it. That's the thing nobody can take away from me. I think a lot of people think, because I was 11 weeks behind Jackie, it made it easier for me, and that's not true. We talked about it. I would not say we were close from a social standpoint, but we barnstormed for about 4 years for 30 days. I would see him at certain functions, but we stayed away from the negatives. Jackie lived in Stamford, Connecticut, and Larry over here in New Jersey, and there they are again. The only thing we talked about, there were certain guys who gave him a tough time, and I had certain guys in the American League that gave me a tough time. You see, the focus was trying to be the best baseball player you could be, and you had to be, because when you're talking about 8 teams, that was it in the American League, just 8 teams in those days. You know, you get hurt, and you might have to go back to the minor leagues. You have to concentrate on playing the game as well as you can. And one of the other things, and I think he felt the same way I felt, why stir up things? It's tough enough going through the summer, going through what you are going to go through. You don't want to go through to talk about the same thing in the winter. Let's talk about something positive. Let's be comfortable. Let's be happy. This is my friend, Wally Triplett. He was in his 80s when we became friends. He passed away a couple of years ago in his 90s. He was in Detroit, and I used to speak to him about once a month, and he's got an interesting story. He was the first African-American player to play in a game, a college football game in Texas, the Cotton Bowl in Texas. He also befriended both Jackie Robinson and Larry Doby. Wally Triplett was a chauffeur, confidant, card-playing buddy of Robinson, and he made sure Jackie always got a home-cooked meal when Robinson played in Philadelphia, when Brooklyn played the Phillies. Philadelphia may have been the toughest place in all of baseball for Robinson, but Wally Triplett and his family made it easier for Jackie and provided an oasis away from the pressures Robinson was facing. Philadelphia was the worst team in the league for taunting, said Triplett, who was a sports pioneer in his own right. Philadelphia is where they threw the black cat on the field. This is a very interesting picture. Back in those days, the photographers really had a lot of sway around baseball, and they would tell people, get together, whether they hated each other or not. Like Joe DiMaggio and Mickey Mantle hated each other, but they always posed for the camera. That's Ben Chapman. He was the Philadelphia Phillies manager, and that's Jackie Robinson. And this is after Chapman called him all kinds of names. But Chapman said, in his defense, said, well, we used to call DiMaggio the Big Dago, and we used to call Hank Greenberg the Kike. So we did it to everybody, including Jackie. He called all kinds of names. In this picture, the photographers wanted the two of them to shake hands. Jackie said no. So one of the photographers gave Ben Chapman a bat, and Jackie put his hand on it, and they were able to take the picture, which is kind of an interesting. He didn't want to shake Ben Chapman's hand. Ben Chapman, who was managing the Philadelphia Phillies, made his opposition to Jackie Robinson loud and clear. He spewed insults to Robinson from the dugout, ordered his pitchers to beam the rookie on 3-0 counts rather than walk him. Chapman's antics caused many in baseball to sympathize with Robinson. Now, there is a statue, Coney Island, where the Mets minor league team plays, the Brooklyn Cyclones, and outside of the stadium is the statue of something that may never have happened. Pee Wee Reese putting his arm around Jackie Robinson. There's a story that it happened, but there is no visual proof, and neither Reese nor Robinson ever talked about it, but somehow a story was put together that after Jackie had a hard time, Pee Wee put his hand around his shoulder and said, okay. And they did become friends. Robinson went on to say that the Chapman-led racism actually helped bring the Dodgers team closer together. Perhaps Pee Wee Reese put his arm around Jackie in the following game, maybe not. But the Dodgers would win 94, lose 60. Robinson won the Rookie of the Year award. The team reached the World Series where they were defeated by the Yankees. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever heard of this guy, Joe Tepsick. Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in 1947. But Wally said it should have happened in 1946. Now, I have gone back and forth with baseball historians about this and Wally's story. Now, Wally is connected to Joe Tepsick, as is Jackie. Wally was his roommate when they both went to Penn State when they were in college. And they were on the Penn State football team. He knew Joe rather well. So he has a very weird connection to Robinson through Tepsick. Tepsick befriended Triplett when the two were at Penn State. Tepsick would sign a contract with Brooklyn that had a clause where he could not be sent down to the minor leagues. In 1946, Tepsick was a struggling player with Brooklyn, while Robinson was with the Dodgers AAA team in Montreal. This is Wally. Jackie signed in October in 1945, on October 23rd, and was sent to Montreal. I was at Penn State, and I met Tepsick. Tepsick and I became close friends. In 1946, the Brooklyn Dodger manager, Leo DeRocher, wanted Jackie and asked Tepsick to go down to Montreal. Tepsick said no, which was his right in the contract. Tepsick had signed the contract with Brooklyn and had a clause in the contract that he could decline going to the minor leagues. He delayed Jackie until 1947. He would not go down. I'm sure this is the first time you've ever heard this story. The first time. And there is Jackie in Montreal. According to accounts available in 1946, Tepsick's teammates were hoping that he would accept the demotion and the team would pick up a veteran pinch hitter. But there's no indication that Brooklyn would have added Robinson. But Triplett said the Dodgers manager Leo DeRocher wanted Jackie. Jackie signed in 1945 with the Dodgers. Jackie would make his major league debut on April 15th and became friendly with Triplett. Wally had worked around baseball as a kid. His father worked for Ed Bolden's Philadelphia Stars Negro League team. He knew Satchel Paige and others through his father. He struck up a conversation with Robinson after a game, took him home. He would do the same for Major League Baseball's second Negro player, Cleveland's Larry Doby, in 1947, later on that year. Philadelphia had two Major League teams, the National League Phillies and the American League A's. Connie Mack, the owner and manager of the A's, wasn't too keen on allowing Negroes into his stadium to watch the A's. And there is Jackie Robinson. Took Jackie home, let him kill some time. Triplett said about his role as Jackie's driver and friend, "My mother cooked him special rolls in Greensboro. My mother fell in love with him. He was a nice guy. Branch Rickey selected Jackie because he knew he could withstand the golf. He was a nice person. We used to play pinochle all night, and then I would drive him back to the hotel. He always got a meal from my mother." So why Jackie? Why not Larry Doby or Satchel Paige as the number one guy to do the desegregation? Well, Triplett has an interesting insight into baseball history. He understood why Robinson, not Doby, not Satchel Paige, was the first Negro player in Big League Baseball since the 1880s. Jackie was a good diplomat. Larry always thought he should have been the first, but Doby wasn't as bubbly a personality as Satchel. Doby hated Satchel. They hated one another because Larry once told me he was kind of like Stephen Fetchit, and he didn't like that. And was more matter of fact in personality than Jackie. After baseball, oh, by the way, did Jackie Robinson retire as a member of the Brooklyn Dodgers, yes or no? He didn't. He was traded to the New York Giants for Dick Littlefield, but he never played for the New York Giants. Even though there was a big spread in the newspaper with him in his Giant uniform and Jackie Jr. in the Giants uniform. He went to work for Chock full of Nuts, the Heavenly Coffee. In 1956, he became an executive for Chock full of Nuts, the restaurant chain, and an advocate for integrating corporate America. He lent his name and prestige to several business ventures, including a construction company and a black-owned bank in Harlem. But he never got an offer to stay in baseball. And there is Wally Triplett. Triplett was one of two Negro players on Penn State who desegregated the Dallas Cotton Bowl. 1948, Dennis Hogard was the other. 1947, the Cotton Bowl in Dallas wanted Penn State to play SMU in the January 1st, 1948 game, but the game organizers did not want Wally Triplett or Dennis Hogard to play. But he played. There he is, carrying the ball. No face mask. And that may be a leather helmet. Penn State players were asked, do you want to go without your teammates to Dallas? And Matt Suhey, who played with the Chicago Bears, his father, Steve Suhey, was the quarterback at Penn State, said, no, we are Penn State, and the Negro players were part of the team. And there is a slogan in Penn State now that's being used, we are Penn State, and that's basically refers to Wally Triplett. Penn State's opponent, Southern Methodist University, came up with a suggestion, stay at the Dallas Naval Air Station. Penn State accepted, practiced at the military installation, and played the game. I do a whole talk, in fact, I'm here in June, so I'll probably do this whole talk about Marty Glickman, Sam Stoller, Gretel Bergman, who were the three most prominent Jews not to be in the 1936 Olympics. And it's a 40-minute, 50-minute talk. Another guy you probably never heard of is Ernest Janke. He was an American International Olympic Committee delegate, and he was expressing outrage with reports he was receiving as a former Assistant Secretary of the Navy about what was going on within Hitler's Germany. And on November 25th, 1935, he sends a letter to the IOC president, Count Henri Latour, initially floating the idea of an American boycott of the 1936 Hitler Summer Berlin Games. Neither Americans nor the representatives of other countries can take part in the games in Nazi Germany without at least acquiescing in the contempt of the Nazis for fair play and their sordid exploitation of the games. The letter went unanswered. Janke was the former Assistant Secretary for the United States Navy and was of German descent. He would be thrown out of the International Olympic Committee by July 1939. His spot was taken by a racist anti-Semite by the name of Avery Brundage, and that might be the nicest thing you could say about Avery Brundage. I was at the Holocaust Museum in Washington when I learned more about this guy. His name is Judge Jeremiah Mahoney, and on December 8, 1935, Mahoney said the United States needs to boycott the Hitler Olympics. In April 1933, an Aryans-only policy was instituted in all German athletic organizations. Non-Aryans, Jews, or individuals with German parents and Romas or Gypsies were systematically excluded from German sports facilities and associations. He said, Judge Mahoney, Jeremiah Mahoney, there's no room for discrimination on grounds of race, color, or creed in the Olympics. The AAU, Amateur Athletic Union, which he was head of, in 1933 accepted an invitation to compete in Berlin in 1939, providing that Germany pledged that there would be no discrimination against Jewish athletes. If that pledge is not kept, I personally do not see why we should compete. But Ben Johnson was really upset with Judge Mahoney, very upset with Judge Mahoney. Mahoney was responsible for selection of the Olympic team. Ben Johnson said, the Negro of the South is discriminated against as much as the Jews in Germany. It's futile and hypocritical that Judge Mahoney should attempt to clean up conditions in Germany before cleaning up similar conditions in America. Well, Franklin Roosevelt said the athletes should go. This is a political problem. We should settle it. And I worked with Marty Glickman in 1988 at his broadcasting school, and I asked him about it. He said, no, we should have gone. We should have gone. I wanted to win that gold medal in the relay. I wanted that gold medal around my neck, and I was going to stick it right into the Fuhrer's face, along with Sam Stoller, his teammate, who was going to run in the same race. Two New York Jews sticking it right in the Fuhrer's face. They didn't have a chance. But Jesse Owens had the chance. He took Marty's spot. Nazi Germany used the 1936 Olympic Games for propaganda purposes. The Nazis promoted an image of a new, strong, and united Germany while masking Germany's growing militarism. And there is Marty to the left, the fastest kid in Brooklyn. He was 18 years old. He was sure he was going to win the gold medal, but he wasn't sure if he could do it in 1940 because he'd be 22. Never got that opportunity again. Nor did Sam, who was 21 at the time. They were both benched by the coach Dean Cromwell, and Marty thinks Avery Brundage. Day before the event, the 4x100 meter relay, they were replaced by Jesse Owens and Ralph Metcalf, both African American. The team's fastest sprinters. The coaches claimed they needed their fastest runners to win the race. Glickman said that Coach Dean Cromwell and Avery Brundage were motivated by anti-Semitism and the desire to spare the Fuhrer the embarrassing sight of two Americans on the winning podium. Stoller didn't think it was anti-Semitism, but he also described the incident as the most humiliating episode in his life. Marty could talk. He was an announcer. He could talk till you're blue in the face. Sam was very reserved. Didn't have much to say. We were shocked, this is Marty, we were shocked. Sam was completely stunned. He didn't say a word in the meeting. I was a brash 18-year-old kid from Brooklyn. Anybody here from Brooklyn? Are you brash? You're not brash?
Kind of.
You're not in somebody's face? Then how could you not be from Brooklyn? Anyway, I was a brash 18-year-old kid, and I said, Coach, you can't hide world-class sprinters. At which point Jesse spoke up and said, Coach, I've won my 3 gold medals, the 100, 200, and long jump. I'm tired. I've had it. Let Marty and Sam run. They deserve it, said Jesse. And Cromwell pointed his finger at him and said, you'll do as you're told. In those days, black athletes did as they were told, and Jesse was quiet after that. Draper and Woodward, the two white guys here on the right, stayed on the team, but Marty was gone and Sam was gone. On August 3rd, 1936, Jesse Owens won the first of his 4 gold medals in the following categories. The 100 meter, 200 meter, the long jump, and the 4x100 meter relay. That was the one that Marty was supposed to be in. Owens was the most successful athlete at the 1936 Berlin Summer Olympics, and as a black man, he dispelled Adolf Hitler's idea of Aryan supremacy. You ever take a look at Hitler and say, what's supremacy? And do you know, Hitler wasn't even German. He was Austrian. He was Austrian. And under his Nazi doctrine in 1920, where they want to throw everybody out, including non-Germans, he would have thrown himself out. Go figure. And there's Jesse Owens, who was snubbed by Franklin Roosevelt. Hitler didn't snub me. It was Roosevelt who snubbed me. The president didn't even send me a telegram. Roosevelt never publicly acknowledged Owens' triumphs or the triumphs of any of the 18 African Americans who competed at the Berlin Olympics. Only white Olympians were invited to the White House in 1936. Roosevelt's running for re-election, and he needs the Solid South to win again. So you can figure out why he wasn't invited. The relatives of Owens and 17 other African Americans who competed at the 1936 Olympics were welcomed to the White House by President Barack Obama in 2016, 80 years later, in a celebration of their lives and accomplishments. Why the snub? Well, Roosevelt's running for re-election. Didn't want to upset members of his own party. It was Southern Democrats who enacted Jim Crow laws after the Civil War. But he broke through the color barrier. Joe Louis. He was the world heavyweight champion for 12 years, 24 bouts, longer than anybody before or since. When the United States entered World War II, Joe Louis enlisted in the Army. Might be a lot wrong with America, but nothing Hitler can fix, he said. He fought exhibition matches to raise money for the armed services, boost morale for the troops. He made donations to military relief funds. The historian Jeffrey Salmon says Joe Louis set a stunning example through his acts of patriotism, and even the South responded appreciatively. Elgin Baylor was one of the great basketball players of all time, but as Bert Sugar, the sports historian and writer and boxing writer, once told me, if it didn't happen on ESPN, which started in 1979, it just didn't happen. He makes a stand in 1959. It's January 16, 1959, and he refuses to play in a neutral site game. NBA in those days, if somebody had a court willing to give you money, that's where you play. It was the Cincinnati Royals and the Minneapolis Lakers in Charleston, West Virginia. Baylor and his black teammates couldn't stay at the all-white hotel with the rest of the team, and he says, I ain't playing. And he refused to play, didn't play. I love basketball. I like playing in the league very much, but not at the expense of my dignity. Now, there are all smiles here, Elgin Baylor and Bob Short, but Bob Short, the owner of the Minneapolis Lakers, was furious with Baylor. Bob Short and the NBA president, Maurice Puloff, publicly, they were friends with Baylor. Privately, they were arrayed. Anyway, the league ultimately made a rule change. Teams would not play in segregated states unless teams were guaranteed shared accommodation for all players. Walter Beach is still a civil rights activist all these years later. This is 63 years ago now. This is him with the Cleveland Browns, but he was with the American Football League's Boston Patriots. Why didn't athletes protest before this? Well, Walter Beach was fired by the AFL's Boston Patriots in 1961, labeled as a troublemaker for organizing a protest among black players against segregated living conditions during the team's road trip in a preseason game to New Orleans. He was let go because he said, I'm a member of this team, these guys are a member of the team, we stayed together, same hotel, same bus, no can do. Jim South, well, I'm going to go on strike. You're fired. And he was fired. They couldn't fire Bill Russell, the Boston Celtics franchise. They couldn't fire him. And this is 1961, a couple of weeks after Walter Beach. And Bill Russell decides, I'm not playing in the game, and it's a preseason game in Lexington, Kentucky. While in Lexington for an exhibition game, Bill Russell and the other black members of the Boston Celtics were refused service at a restaurant. They boycotted the game. Blacks were still expected not to complain publicly about discrimination. Bill Russell and Casey Jones took Zach Sanders and Sam Jones to see the coach, Red Auerbach of the Celtics. I told Red, we're leaving. It was because it was important to me that everybody, everywhere knows that black players are deciding they'll stand up for themselves. And there was a boycott of a preseason game led by Bill Russell. Sam Jones and Tom Zach Sanders were refused service in the coffee shop at the team hotel in Lexington. We had gone downstairs to eat, and they said, we really can't serve you people. That was Sanders 6 years ago. A fifth player for the Celtics, rookie Al Butler, Negro player, left them. And two black players for the St. Louis Hawks also joined the boycott. One of those St. Louis players was Cleo Hill, first-round pick, who earlier that year had been denied service in Lexington. Russell had clout. Hill didn't. And there's Cleo Hill, number 24. During the 1961-62 season, the St. Louis Hawks coach, Paul Seymour, was told by team management, owner Ben Kerner, to severely diminish Hill's offensive role so that stars Bob Pettit and Cliff Hagan and Clyde Lavalette, who were all white, would receive more shots. Seymour refused. He was fired, replaced by Fuzzy Lavani, and then Pettit and Hill's scoring average dropped. Pettit and then Hill's scoring average dropped to from 10.8 points a game to 5.5 points per game. Hill never played in the NBA after that season. He said he didn't think race played a part in ending his career. What do you think? Al Davis has got this Darth Vader persona about him. But I worked with John Madden for 15 years, and I saw the other side of Al Davis, the side where he took exquisite care of his wife, Carol, who's still alive, who suffered a massive, massive stroke in the late 1970s and used to walk around like this. But he took care of her, and he got her to the point where she could get around like that. And he took care of former players and adversaries like Hank Stram, the coach of the Kansas City Chiefs. And that guy, the blonde-haired guy on the right side, Jim Otto, took care of him. Al Davis took care of people. Just didn't want you to know it. And this is something that comes out in 1963 with AD. It's a football game in Mobile, Alabama. It's August 1963, and 6 African-American members of the Oakland Raiders refused to play in an exhibition game against the New York Jets at Ladd Stadium, which had segregated seating. Mobile had hosted 3 prior AFL preseason games in 1960, 61, and 62, and there was 33-year-old Al Davis. Clement Daniels, Art Powell, Bo Roberson, Fred Williamson, and Robert Jones and Eugene White said, we're not playing. Guess what? Al Davis said, they don't have to play. We're not going. This is the stadium there today, Ladd Peoples Stadium. And you talk about condescending words. Check out this, Ray Schuessler Jr., the Ladd Stadium manager in 1963. We don't want 4 boys from Oakland telling us how to run our stadium. We're going to integrate quietly. Now we're going to go ahead as in the past for other exhibition games here. Clement Daniels said, I want to play in Mobile before an integrated crowd and contribute in a small way to the breaking down of these needless prejudices. The game was played in Oakland. Al Davis supported his guys and they played in Oakland. The AFL never returned to Mobile. The Civil Rights Act was passed, signed into law by Lyndon Johnson July the 7th, 1964. 1965, the game in Mobile was integrated. They had to. They had no choice. They did so reluctantly, and the Senior Bowl is still played to this day. Cookie Gilchrist was a running back with the Buffalo Bills, and the American Football League was going to hold an all-star game in New Orleans with the intention of having a team in New Orleans. And this is where the Super Bowl starts. For anybody who watched the Super Bowl and wanted to know how the Super Bowl came to be, this is the story. The American Football League was the only league at the time to truly embrace African American athletes as an equal on the field with white players. And there are some of the players looking kind of depressed, leaving New Orleans. Butch Bird, Earl Faison, Curtis McClinton. I'm not sure who that guy is who's looking down. And they're leaving New Orleans. They're not walking to New Orleans. Could have walked to New Orleans. That's dominant. New Orleans leaders said the city was going to welcome the AFL All-Stars, 22 black players included, with open arms. Segregation, Jim Crow, they're ending. It's our history. It's part of our history, but no, don't worry about it. It's not here anymore. And the city desperately wanted a professional football team. And that is the 1963 American Football League All-Star program. Forget the coaches, Henry and Pop Ivy. But you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 white guys, and 1, 2, and 3. 1, 2, 3 African Americans. 37.5% of the players on that program are Negroes. NFL scouts went to watch players from big-time schools and conferences. The AFL looked for players with a different background from black schools such as Grambling and Bethune-Cookman and Prairie View. Ironically, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 destroyed the black college football programs as the best players could attend the big schools. Would you want to mess with this guy? Ernie Ladd, 6'9" and weighed about 315 pounds. You want to mess with him? No. Well, this is what's going on in New Orleans. Abner Haynes, who's a friend of mine, still alive, he's down in Dallas, told me that in fact, he wanted me to write his book, and I said, I don't write biographies. I can't do that. I'm not that type of writer. Oh, come on, you can do that. But he gave me some stories, and I'm going to tell you a couple of them here. Anyway, Ernie Ladd there was one of the 22 black players that could not get a cab ride into New Orleans. Remember, they were promised, hey, you can get into New Orleans. You go to New Orleans, you're going to play football. Well, the players get into the airport. And that is the first bad sign. Clement Daniels said that cab after cab passed them, but the white players got in cabs with no problem. When a black player went to hop into a cab with a white teammate, the cabbie would say no can do because that was the custom in New Orleans, except for Cookie Gilchrist, because Jack Kemp, remember Jack Kemp? He ran for vice president with Robert Dole. Yeah. He was the first presidential candidate I ever interviewed in Spark Hill, New York, when I was 23. And he was running for the Republican nomination May of 1979. And he said he vouched for Cookie Gilchrist. The black players were denied access at some restaurants and nightclubs in the French Quarter, and Ernie Ladd claimed that a bouncer pulled a gun on him when he tried to enter the club. Now, the story is, Ernie Ladd's 6'9", Earl Faison 6'4", Dick Westmoreland 6'2". They're walking down Bourbon Street, and they hear James Brown blasting out of a club, the Playboy Club. And Ernie Ladd decides to go in there. And the bouncer said, I wouldn't go in there if I were you. And Ernie Ladd, there's no door here, ripped the door off the hinge and said, I'm going in. And the guy pulled out a gun. He said, I told you, if I were you, I wouldn't go in there. The players fled. They were called all kinds of names. And couldn't get cabs, all that other stuff. They eventually did get cabs because Jack Kemp, he took responsibility for Cookie Gilchrist. Jack was 29. He's responsible for a 31-year-old grown man in the car. He got a call at the hotel. We're still out here, and Jack, who is the executive director of the American Football League Players Association, called Bud Adams, the Houston Oilers owner. He calls the governor, John McKeithen, said, our guys are there. So McKeithen says, we'll get the colored cabs out for the colored players. So this guy, Abner Haynes, does get a cab and eventually gets to the Hotel Roosevelt. There were two hotels, the Roosevelt and the Fontainebleau. And he checks in with his teammate, David Grayson. Not a problem. How many of you remember the old crank elevators with somebody sitting there cranking it up and opening the fence? Well, they check in, there's not a problem. They walk over to the elevator, the doors open up, and the woman said, "What are you monkeys doing here?" The rest of the story is after. This was part of the book that he wanted me to write, but I didn't have time. They had a woman operating the elevator, and she said, "You monkeys come in and get to the back." Finally, about 10 or 12 guys in my room were talking sensibly. We're going to stay together. This was just another test. By the way, these guys, 22, did it all on their own. No help from any civil rights group. They did it all by themselves.
What year was that?
65.
60.
We had no leverage. We weren't playing for money, but we were playing for progress. Football players took the lead. Actually, Elgin Baylor did, and then Walter Beach, and then Bill Russell. Places like Atlanta, New Orleans, Miami were death holes. Dave Grayson couldn't get a drink at the bar. Our white teammates in New Orleans were there for us, and including this guy, Jack Kemp. And Jack Kemp, years later, takes a look at the picture because he wanted to get an autograph put up on the wall after he was done. And he looks at me and he said, "What happened to your hair?" And I said, "What happened to your wig? It's white." There he is with my son, 34, well, how many years later? That was 24 years later, and you can see he had a powder white wig at that point. One of the things we, the AFL, needed was the unity of the white and black players for a new league. When the white players like Jack Kemp, Jerry Mays, who was our Kansas City defensive leader, or 4 or 5 other guys heard about what was happening, their characters showed that my teammates were looking after me. In 2014, members of the National Basketball Association's Los Angeles Clippers team decided that they were going to boycott the NBA playoffs because the owner of the team, Donald Sterling, was caught on tape talking to his mistress, V. Stelenia. "You're bringing too many black guys to games. I don't want you to do that." Well, the tape somehow ended up with Harvey Levin and TMZ, and the players were going to strike. And I knew Ron Mix. First guy I called was Ron Mix saying, "Tell me about the difference between 1965 and what's going on in 2019. And he said, "We were aware that New Orleans was hosting a game to demonstrate to the American Football League and National Football League New Orleans, could support the franchise. The last thing we wanted to do was assist them in demonstrating they could support the franchise. A boycott was the only alternative for the players." The mayor of New Orleans was Victor Shiro at the time. And he said the black players should have just rolled with the punches. Hey, take a bullet if you have to, right? In the early last case. The governor, John McKeithen, said, "There are some clubs on Bourbon Street that won't even let our district attorney in." Jim Garrison was the district attorney. Does that name ring a bell for you?
Yes. With the
Yeah, he was the one with the Kennedy assassination conspiracies. So maybe that's why they wouldn't let him in. The game was played in Houston. New Orleans was on the outside looking in. Eventually, New Orleans would become a political pawn in Congress. There was a trade of a franchise in exchange for votes in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, led by the Louisiana Democrat, the 5th most powerful Democrat in the Senate, Russell Long, and Cookie Roberts' father, Hale Boggs, the representative. And it was Boggs that got the deal done. The Super Bowl would rise out of the ashes of the New Orleans boycott after all of the horse trading was done in Congress. That's Muhammad Ali and me, 1985. Unfortunately for me, his Parkinson's, whatever he had, it kicked in and he wasn't speaking much above a whisper. He identified with Jack Johnson. 1968 Broadway play, James Earl Jones, is based on the life of Jack Johnson. Ali said that if you take the issue of white women and replace it with religion, that's my story, the Great White Hope. Johnson dated white women and was married 3 times to white women. The Mann Act. Now, the Mann Act is if you take a woman over state lines for immoral purposes, if you're a guy, you can get thrown in jail. It's very rarely enacted. Charlie Chaplin and Chuck Berry were both arrested under the Mann Act because they wanted to get him. Congress passed the Mann Act in 1909, and the law made it illegal to transport any girl or woman over state lines for any immoral purpose. Johnson was arrested, sent to jail for a year. He would flee to Europe after getting out of jail. Donald Trump pardoned him in 2018. And like I said, it's something that is very rarely enforced. The draft. Why should they ask me, Ali, to put on a uniform and go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs on brown people in Vietnam while so-called Negro people in Louisville are treated like dogs and denied simple human rights? I am here at the edge of the picture. I'm holding my mic back because I'm asking a question of Ali here. Ali was drafted by the United States military in 1966, called up for induction in 1967. He attended the induction, refused to answer his name or take the oath. This led to his arrest and conviction, which in 1971 was overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. The Cleveland Summit, and in this picture in the back is Walter Beach. That's then Lou Alcindor, Jimmy Brown, Bill Russell, John Wooden in the background as well, who should have made this talk but didn't because of time. And they were talking about whether or not to support Muhammad Ali and whether he was sincere in not wanting to be in the army. Jim Brown once told me, I felt with Ali taking the position he was taking and with him losing the crown and with the government coming at him with everything they had, that we as a body of prominent athletes could get the truth and stand behind Ali and give him the necessary support. 11 athletes supported Ali. Part of Ali's problem was never got due process. His license, boxing license, taken away by the state of New York, and he was stripped of the crown of his titles without ever getting due process. And my friend, the late Shelley Saltman, who is probably listening right now and saying, my ears are hot, let me call, said that he didn't really want to work for Muhammad Ali in 1971, that he was only there to get paid. Ali sat down with him for 5 hours, and Shelley was begging him in 1979, because he was so sincere, don't fight anymore. You don't need the money. Don't fight. It's going to ruin you. And Shelley quit along with Ferdy Pacherko, the doctor, because they didn't want to see their friend being beaten up. My buddy Irv Cross, who passed away 2 years ago, a number of years ago, he called me and said, what you up to? It was Super Bowl time, and said, going to talk about the Super Bowl. He said, hold on. I said, what's up, Irv? He said, let me think about this for a second. You going to talk about the quota? Yeah, I said I'm going to talk about the quota. He said, hold on. It was me, Tim Brown, Clarence Peaks, Ted Dean, 4 African-American players on the Philadelphia Eagles my rookie year, 1961. Perfect 4. All you needed was 2 hotel rooms on the road. There was a quota in the National Football League. Tim Brown, Ted Dean, Clarence Peaks, and Irv Cross were all part of the 1961 Philadelphia Eagles. You couldn't be a quarterback because you weren't smart enough if you were African-American. You couldn't be a middle linebacker. You weren't smart enough. Or a center. You weren't smart enough. That's how things were in the National Football League. George Preston Marshall, who I talked about a little bit before, in the 1950s, an NFL team could have up to 4 Negro players per team, none of them quarterbacks, centers, middle linebackers. College quarterbacks became defensive backs, receivers, or halfbacks. George Preston Marshall's Washington NFL team refused to hire a Negro in the 1950s. This is when John Kennedy steps in. In 1962, Cleveland traded Bobby Mitchell to Washington in what was a straight football deal for a top draft pick that was initiated by the Kennedy administration. Cleveland got the NFL rights to Syracuse University running back Ernie Davis. The Washington owner, George Preston Marshall, who never hid his racial views, did not hire any Negroes for his team. But he wanted to play in this place because it would have made more money for him. D.C. Stadium. I don't know if you know anything about the politics of Washington, D.C., but basically the money is controlled by the federal government. As somebody once pointed out to me, why should Charles Schumer or Mitch McConnell set the budget for Washington, D.C. schools? They do. Washington should be a state. Federal government should not be running the school system of Washington, D.C. Anyway, that forced Marshall's hand as President John F. Kennedy's Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udell, pushed Marshall, made him obey legislation that prohibited discrimination in federal facilities. D.C. Stadium was a federal facility. Udell gave Marshall an ultimatum. either hire Negro players or find somewhere else to play. I interviewed Curt Flood a year or two before his passing, and he challenged baseball's reserve clause because players get traded. And in the winter, at the December winter meetings, players get traded all the time like pieces of meat. And he got traded in 1969. He didn't like it. And I asked him about it. He said, the meat market. He said, Evan, I'm so pleased you said that. That was Curt Flood's response to a question back in the early 1990s when I asked him about baseball's fans' joy of the winter meetings, which is a meat market for baseball teams who trade human beings for others in the hopes their teams will improve and yet forget they're trading a human being. Curt Flood challenged baseball's reserve clause after being traded by St. Louis to Philadelphia in December 1969. I guess a week went by before you say to yourself, this is not a joke. This is serious. You no longer work here. And I guess about a week, and I talked to Alan Zerman, who was my attorney then in St. Louis. He said, Curt, you know, baseball's been doing this to men for 200 years. Actually, it's 100 years at that point, since they first paid players. And you're just part of the machinery, and there's very little you can do about it. You can challenge this if you want to, and it started to germinate then that something illegal had been done to me. Something almost inhumane had been done to me. It kind of snowballed from there. And there was Arthur Goldberg, the former Supreme Court Justice, who was Curt Flood's attorney. I learned all about the law system and how it operates. I guess not playing that 1 year in 1970, it is necessary to be damaged in that 1 year, and that would have done that. And then I thought about later on, I wished I had not played 1 year in 1971 with the Washington Senators, and the only thing that made me do it was manager Ted Williams. I love him. The Supreme Court, I guess they felt the same way, that being a baseball player is the best of all worlds. I ought to sit down and someplace and shut up. The Supreme Court did not say that. They were going to leave this decision to someone else. That someone else was an arbitrator by the name of Peter Seitz, who in 1975 nullified baseball's reserve clause. National Basketball Association, most of their players are African American, but that was not always the case. And that is John McClendon, who I interviewed in 1995. In 1946, a new basketball league called the Basketball Association of America formed with teams mostly in the big eastern cities like the New York Knicks, the Philadelphia Warriors, the Boston Celtics, Washington Capitals. Arena owners were looking to fill dates. For some reason, only known to BAA owners, the league put up a color barrier. McClendon, who was coaching for the North Carolina College for Negroes, would alert an NBA team, telling team officials he knew of African Americans who could play in the league. And in 1950, McClendon got the Washington Capitals to take a look at some players he thought should be in the league, like Earl Lloyd. McClendon forced the issue and brought two players to try out for Washington in 1950, and that brought down the barrier. The Washington Capitals were the first team to have historically black school products on the team. They preceded Boston by 1 week. There were two guys ahead of Boston Celtics' Chuck Cooper, Harold Hunter, and Earl Lloyd. McClendon also was a trailblazer. He was the first African-American coach of a professional Major League Basketball, any coach. Well, I guess Fritz Pollard was in the NFL, co-coached back with the Akron Pros in 1921. But he was the head coach as opposed to a co-coach. And he was hired by a guy who you might have heard of, George M. Steinbrenner III. Ever hear of him? He was the first black coach in pro basketball's history with George Steinbrenner's Cleveland Pipers in 1961 in the American Basketball League. George fired him because Bill Sharman, who was a big name, became available, and George was infatuated with big names. McClendon said he was glad he was fired. His next job was in Malaysia. He wanted to get as far away from George Steinbrenner as
Yeah, yeah,
possible.
but we're off this Monday.
There are a lot of other stories. I don't know if you want to be kept here for another 10, 15, 20 minutes and hear more stories, because I have
But
them.
anyway.
If not, I could add, it's up to you. I can end there, or we can go on. What do you think?
It's just amazing that this stuff went on in the sixties.
Yeah, I got one
It
more
just
thing.
seems like the
I
other
got
day.
one more 1960 story. One more. Mexico City, the Olympics. And Tommy Smith in the middle, and John Carlos on the right, Peter Norman on the left. The Olympic Project for Human Rights. Tommy Smith originally advocated the boycott of the 1968 Mexico City Olympics by the Americans. His reasons? South Africa and Rhodesia, uninvited from the Olympics because of apartheid. The restoration of Muhammad Ali's world heavyweight title. Avery Brundage, the racist anti-Semite, stepped down as president of the IOC, and the hiring of more African-American assistant coaches.
Okay?
The protests following the 10-meter race had been something two medal winning athletes had planned for a while. The gold medal winner was Smith. The bronze medal winner, John Carlos. And they walked to the podium and they took off their shoes to protest poverty. They wore beads and a scarf to protest lynchings. And when the national anthem was played, they lowered their heads in defiance, raised their fists in a Black Power salute. There you go. I don't like the idea of people looking at it as a negative. Dr. Smith, who was a college professor at Oberlin University, one of his students was my wife's cousin. There was nothing but a raised fist in the air and a bowed head acknowledging the American flag, not symbolizing a hatred for it. Carlos, who worked as a guidance counselor at Palm Springs High School in California, told the Guardian newspaper had a moral obligation to step up. Morality was a far greater force than the rules and regulations they had. On their left breast, his left breast, the Australian Norman wore a small badge that read Olympic Project for Human Rights, an organization set up a year previously opposed to racism in sport. Norman suggests that Carlos and Smith split the gloves. Norman asked a member of the United States rowing team if he could borrow a badge that read Olympic Project for Human Rights, a project set up to oppose racism in sports. Tommy Smith did play in the American Football League, which merged with the National Football League in 1969. Smith and Carlos played in the AFL and the NFL. Smith played the season with Paul Brown's Bengals. Carlos played 1 year with the Philadelphia Eagles, 1 year in the Canadian Football League. Smith and Carlos kept their medals. They were never asked to return them to the International Olympic Committee. And then we will leave with Arthur Ashe. You talked about the 1960s. Arthur Ashe's fight against apartheid. 1969, Ashe applied for a visa to travel to South Africa and compete in the South African Open. He was denied a South African visa despite his #1 rating. He continued to apply for visas and the country continued to deny it. In protest, he used this example of discrimination to campaign for the expulsion of the nation from the International Lawn Tennis Federation. South Africa eventually granted Arthur a visa in 1973. He was the first black pro to play in the national championships. As part of a 31-member delegation, he got to observe the political changes in the country as it began repealing apartheid legislation and moving towards integration. 1960s. A lot of this took place in the 1960s.
It seems like just the other day.
And well,
You know?
you know,
I don't think it went on.
yeah, well, it continued.
There wasn't as much TV then, too.
Yeah, but the thing is, as she said, it was on TV. And I gave you a talk here in 1968, the year in review, from television perspective. You sat there, they delivered. 1960s, part of this was delivered by television into your living room. Any other questions or comments? No. None? None?
Excuse me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let me tell you something. I came from Cuba in
Yeah.
1961.
Okay, you were one of those who got out.
Yes.
Yeah.
I went to a store very famous in Miami. I think it exists, called Verdines.
Yeah.
And I wanted to go to the ladies' room. In
Thank
Cuba, in Cuba, we had no discrimination whatsoever.
Yeah.
So there was a white and color.
Oh, yeah?
And then I went into the corner because I had no clue what it meant. And you should have seen the ladies there asking me, what are you doing here?
Yeah.
I said, I came to the bus. You do not belong here.
Yeah.
And to me it was amazing.
Yep.
Oh, gosh.
I will see you in June.
When I lived in
It's gonna be a while.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I will see you in June.